Thank you very much. I'm going to present the paper that I have entitled Member Apart, Bakhtin and the Notion of Dialogism. In a book from 1990 entitled Dialogism, written by Michael Holquist, the foremost English-speaking scholar of the Soviet thinker Mikhail Bakhtin, the author admits to that the term dialogism itself was never used by Bakhtin during his lifetime to describe the complex system of philosophical and literary investigations he undertook. But the notion is not Holquist and has followed Bakhtin since he was first introduced to Western readership. Svetan Todorov, who together with Julia Kristeva brought Bakhtin to France in the 1970s, used it as early as 1984 in a chapter title. Yet there is no doubt that Bakhtin would have rejected instinctively the notion of dialogism. The transformation of a method of dialogue into dialogism would probably have corresponded to his description of the move from Socratic dialogue to Hegelian Marxist dialectics. In one passage of his 1970-71 notebooks, he attacks dialectics as being a dialogue first robbed of its voices, its intonations, its living responses, and then crammed into one abstract consciousness. Formalization, codification of the context, was finality and death. Creating a dialectics of something equal, discontinuing the dialogue with it. Dialogism could thus be understood as the sign of the dialogue that the dialogue with the dialogue had ceased. This is, of course, an exaggeration on my part, but I will try to illustrate how it's also both right and wrong, how we can save dialogism from Bakhtin himself. In his early Kantian and philosophical period, Bakhtin used the notion of the dialogue to describe the process of what we can call individuation. Even though Bakhtin later would place emphasis on language, he is here concerned with the spatial and the act of seeing. There is excess in seeing insofar as I can see the parts of the body of the other that this other cannot perceive him or herself. The same is true for all kinds of knowledge. The dialogue is a process of co-individuation in which two non-divergent horizons come together by a projection of two others into each other. We need to understand our being not as simple mirrors, but in a metastable system of individuation in which existence is constituted by an interaction between two or more parts. It is, in other words, ourselves constituted, not reflected, we experience in others. The I without the other, as a reflection, Bakhtin described as empty, ghostly, and eerie. The subject experiences through an object. It is only by experiencing through the object's love or fear that the subject can understand itself. But for the communication between two individuals to be possible, they have to enter into an ethical relationship of care, what Bakhtin called the enveloping atmosphere of deepest trust, in which the subjects invite each other to assume each other's position as a precursor to completing each other's horizons. The atmosphere for this encounter was essentially to be transitional in the sense of Donald Winnicott. In the return to itself, the subject not only avoided a pathological identification with another, for example with someone else's suffering, but it was also in this shift back that the experience of seeing through the other could be rendered, quote, ethically, cognitively, or aesthetically, end of quote. Though Bakhtin's philosophy owes a lot to Kant and is a return to Kant through a rejection of the transcendentalism of neo-Kantianism, it can also be read, as Peter Sima has done, as a dialogue with the young Hegelians. As they, he attacked the notion of harmonious totality in Hegel and embraced ambivalence and openness by rejecting the notion of Aufhebung, synthesis, and with it Hegel's notions of truth. The fundamental difference between his position and that of the young Hegelians was Bakhtin's reluctance to praise the conflict between the binaries. Truth was not in conflict, but in the attempt to make binaries communicate. In other words, we can describe it as a movement towards a fruitful metastability between units such as self and other. This metastability presupposed the possibility of communication and dialogue if there if there were such a thing as dialogism, its creed would be that participants in a relationship must be answerable for their enunciations. This answerability protects the metastability of a co-individuation in which subjects discover themselves both in their uniqueness and in their organic belonging to a unity of means, as it were, as opposed to the harmonious unity of ends in Kant. The stress on answerability led Bakhtin to a rejection of the technological in favor of the organic world of the word, the enunciation that had someone behind it. In his first published essay, Art and Answerability from 1919, he claimed the existence of two different unities, one mechanical and the other the unit of answerability. In later writings, he would develop his critique of the mechanical as a space comprising of all kinds of theories and abstractions, following its own detached immanent law and not communicating with the environment. The result of this non-communication was a deeply pharmacological situation. What had been rational could become, quote, terrifying, deadly, and destructive force, end of quote, serving evil rather than good. It had, in short, become irresponsible. I suggest that to understand Bakhtin's argument, we can evoke Marcus Aurelius' reflections in his meditations over the difference between melos and meros, member and part. Rational cooperation was, according to Aurelius, possible when individuals acted as members of one body. If the act was not motivated by something else than the experienced love for one's fellow, one remained apart. The member needed to sympathize with the other members and, following Bakhtin, remain open and associated. The part tended towards disassociation through closed autonomy. It is here important to note that the binary for Bakhtin was not singularity versus unity, but answerability versus irresponsibility. His assumption was that answerability, entering the dialogue through acknowledging one's codependence, was an ethical principle leading to the good. Irresponsibility, on the other hand, could pharmacologically produce negative as well as positive outcomes, which was why it should be avoided, according to Bakhtin. This unity was alien to living historicity, as it constructed a deterministic world in which the subject was unnecessary and non-existence. As thus, it could not, quote, provide any criteria for the life of practice, end quote. Detached parts could, for Bakhtin, never take the ethical space of participating or associated members. Even Kant's categorical imperative became, in Bakhtin's words, an empty demand for legality. An open-ended, radically contingent, and ambiguous answerability was equal to philosophy as a moral activity, and for Bakhtin no real philosophy existed outside of answerability. So Bakhtin would have probably rejected the term dialogism as an embodiment of abstract and theoretical consciousness, separated from historicity, from participation, and plagued by an air of dogmaticism. At the same time, his philosophical writings are characterized by the same lack of answerability that they deplore. They are impersonal, technical, and seemingly existing in an ahistoric realm. Bakhtin was famously irreverent to his own text. Not only were they subject to censorship, but also to his own disregard, as exemplified by him often publishing under pseudonyms and using the paper of his book manuscript on the German novel to roll cigarettes with during the hardships of war. His writings were championed by friends and students, thanks to whom they were republished or published in the early 1960s, leading to his later international fame, which for the most part then happened after his death in 1975. Thus, the proponent of a profoundly Socratic method also inherited Socrates' great distrust of writing in the Phaedrus, an activity he, like Bakhtin, described as a pharmacon. The Phaedrus being an inheritance, of course, they came to writing through a transindividuation by technical means. The middle part of Bakhtin's scholarships was taken up by an engagement with literature, that is, with the pharmacon that he was so deeply ambivalent towards. He wrote 3 important works, of which 2 remains: The Study of Dostoevsky, written in the 1920s, and of Rabelais, written in the 1930s. He saw Dostoevsky as a pioneer of the new polyphonic novel that was profoundly dialogic, a word heir to the Socratic tradition that returns an open-ended unity of dialogue against the corruption, as Bakhtin argued, of Socrates by the later Plato. But there were limits to the dialogic imagination of Dostoevsky. Bakhtin had to concede that Dostoevsky only had been dialogic in his novels. As a public intellectual, he was prone to both close dogmaticism and even eschatology. In his work on Dostoevsky, Bakhtin located the origin of the Socratic dialogue in the folk carnivalistic expression. He develops these thoughts in his large thesis on Rabelais that was to be published as Rabelais in his World. The carnival was, quote, unofficial, extra-ecclesiastical, and extra-political, end of quote. A profoundly democratic rejection of official truths characterized by the negation of the actor-spectator binary. Laughter and profanity challenged the seriousness of the medieval order and subverted its rigid hierarchies. The carnival was not to be seen as a temporary suspension of normality, but rather as an eruption of a profoundly dialogic truth. It was through laughter that the medieval crowd fully realized how they were in fact organic members of a whole rather than mechanical parts of a system. This laughter was ambivalent and universal, a weapon against dogmaticism, intolerance, fanaticism, pedantry, fear, intimidation, and sentimentality. There is a complex attempt to historicize the carnival in Bakhtin's book on Rabelais. He argues that the medieval laughter was repressed by official culture, leading first to the individualization of laughter through satire in the Renaissance, and then to the romantic grotesque that finally co-opted and perverted what Bakhtin termed the realist grotesque of the medieval period. Romanticism rendered the public private, interiorized the carnival. The laughter lost its joy and became more ironic as the grotesque was rewritten as something terrifying and alien to man, as opposed to being a liberating force that emanated from the lived culture of man. The images of the carnival came to represent fear-inducing terror, madness, and vulgarity. Its paraphernalia, like the mask, stopped signifying joy of change, but came to stand for deceiving obfuscations that hid a terrible vacuum. The joyful devil became tragic, and the celebration of spring and light in the medieval carnival was in the neo-Gothicism of Romanticism supplanted by a fascination with darkness and night. The only reconciliation was by way of the transcendental. Laughter became, in other words, traumatic. But this said, Romanticism did make its own important discovery, as Bakhtin puts it, namely, quote, that of the interior subjective man with its depth, complexity, and inexhaustible resources, end of quote. And it was, we might add, the romantic grotesque that shaped the content of Dostoevsky's novel. Bakhtin became concerned, however, with preserving the folk expression of the carnival as a point zero of dialogic forms. In order to understand this, it is important to historicize Bakhtin, just as he historicized Rabelais. Bakhtin's doctoral thesis on Rabelais and the grotesque realism was a thinly disguised attack on the Soviet social realism that the somber officialdom used to co-opt folk forms and taste and to crush the space of the dialogic. The happily vulgar and obscene democratic laughter truly represented the traumatype to a prudish and, despite his protestations, hierarchical political order at the time and place of Bakhtin's writing. His personal courage in presenting his work on Rabelais and the Carnival in the 1940s at the height of Stalinism was considerable, and he was predictably denied the title of doctor and returned to provincial life in obscurity. The earlier work on Dostoevsky, in contrast, tells of slightly different preoccupation, but with the uniting theme of the inherently democratic nature of the polyphonic. What Bakhtin did with Dostoevsky, and even more with Rabelais, was to go into dialogue with writing, and in so doing he moved focus from the metaphor of sight to that of language. It is possible to argue that this represented, despite Bakhtin's own protestation, an attempt to rescue writing from formalization in order to make it instead a member of a living unity, or, in other words, a shift from writing to reading. One of the most poignant examples of Bakhtin's personal history was how he, a dissident, read Stalin's text and attempted to engage in a dialogue with them by writing between the lines, as well as lecturing on topics such as Stalin and the English bourgeoisie, and Marx and Engels on Byron. The dialogue is read before it is written, and this means that the most non-dialogic text furthest out on the negative pharmacological end can be, as it were, re-dialogized. And I would like to propose a reading of Bakhtin's Dialogism as a formalization of this principle. And in order to do this reading, it's important to try to understand the relationship between monologism and the topic of anamnesis, transindividuation, and the trauma type that we have discussed in our seminar the past year. The monologic was for Bakhtin a part as opposed to a member. It was dogmatic, non-ambivalent, and irresponsible. The end of dialogue that had its purest theoretical articulation in philosophical idealism, in which co-individuation took on the guise of the hierarchical relationship between master and student. In the monologue, the metastable relationships between subject and object was always replaced by hierarchical ones, in which the subject was disassociated and, we might say, proletarianized. It follows from this why dialogical speech could be favored over writing, polyphonic fiction over monophonic theory. Bakhtin was at the same time conscious of the fact that it was the large historical trajectory that gave access to the associated environment in which the dialogic could be understood. In his 1970-71 notebooks, Bakhtin suggested concepts that could be seen as equivalent to the long and short circuits of anamnesis. He called these the large versus the small experience. The large experience was absolutely large, encompassing thousands of years of agglomerated human heritage. The small experience was shaped by the symbols of official culture. They were pragmatic, utilitarian, and mechanical. The large focused on epochal shifts, and the small on current stability. Memory did not know the boundaries of the large experience. It even stretched back to the pre-individual world of matter and inorganic forms. It was not a simple remembrance, but a rotating body of recollections that gave life to dialogic forms as opposed to the small experience that enclosed, limited, and objectified the subject. As we have seen with the example of Rabelais, it was, however, via the small memory and the monologism of Soviet dogmatism that Bakhtin accessed a more profound structure of historic and dialogic knowledge. It is when he forgets his historical contingency and ahistorically praised an idealist notion of folk wisdom that his argument in terms becomes most monologic and limited. The dialogism of Bakhtin works as a procedural method for rendering the monologic dialogic, and in so doing performing a long circuit of thought beyond the specificity of the period in which it is enunciated, and also beyond the stupidity of the monologue. It is a historicity of method leading to results that are always possible to historicize within that complex rotating body of memory that constitute the anamnesis. The absence of a theorization of this process in Bakhtin opens the door to invoke the shift from co-individuation to transindividuation that we also have discussed in our seminars. A shift that could be argued to entail, beyond the universalization also that the parts become members and the irresponsible is brought to the level of answerability. Bakhtin's co-individuation as creating an environment of care for the subjects to constitute themselves in each other does, however, give a powerful image for how transindividuation, also via technical means, can lead to a positive as opposed to negative pharmacological outcome. Dialogism is an important part of this. Dialogism as an important part in this individuation entailed, for example, an explicit mention of care and love, and an implicit emphasis on non-violence. In understanding dialogism as a positive theorization and universalization, it follows that it as a principle encourages dialogue not only with the monologic of the surface, but also with the traumatypic manifestations pertaining to the process of individuations, repressions, and denial. In the Soviet Union of the 1940s, the notion of laughter was highly traumatypic. It was both a diabolic historical recurrence that the mainstream wanted to forget, but also a synchronic symbol of the socially repressed that was foreclosed. The brilliance of Bakhtin's reading was how he so pedagogically managed to show that laughter needed only to be traumatic for the monologic officialdom, not for the dialogic imagination. But in order to do this, he needed to return, in a long circuit, to the grotesque realism of the medieval period, bypassing the substantial changes that the notion of the carnival and laughter had undergone from the Renaissance onwards. In Bakhtin's historical scheme, the trauma type changes with time. Today we can say that there is very little repressed when it comes to laughter. The appropriation of a politics of drives by industrial culture led to the movement towards the individual hedonism of socialism in one person. The vulgar, the obscene, and the sexualized human body is ever present in the mainstream. Our culture has created its own industrial grotesque. Bakhtin had a notion that the laughter of the people could produce shame in the rulers. He ended his book on Rabelais with a Pushkin quote from Boris Godunov, 1831, where the false pretender dreams that, quote, "The people swarmed on the public square and pointed laughingly at me, and I was filled with shame and fear," end of quote. The present situation is radically different. Jacques Lacan famously noted the erosion of the capacity to feel shame in Seminar 17, and society has not become less permissive and less shameless since. Maybe it is reason itself that had become repressed in our time, public reason and civic responsibility. A current British example of profoundly dialogic acts of engaging with repressed and establishing long circuits of transindividuation underscores this point. The so-called University for Strategic Optimism has during the last year held public lectures in banks, supermarkets, and next to riot police on the subject of neoliberalism, consumerism, and violence. This is a conscious attempt to reconquer public spaces already financed by tax money, for carrying out impromptu lectures for the public as the system of higher education is becoming more inaccessible as a result of de facto privatizations. This initiative holds on the carnivalistic and dialogic principle that all should be made members, participants, but it uses somber seriousness rather than laughter. A thoughtful and rational analysis of the current political situation in public is now potentially a transgressive act. But more importantly, it is also a re-dialogization and meta-stabilization of the very notion of carnival itself, by the way of anamnesis recalling rational critique. This open unity of parts becoming members can be taken as an image for the positively ambivalent concept of dialogism that has been used to describe the works of Mikhail Bakhtin. Thank you very much.